So, they cross the river to the other side of the temple, and they start asking around and find out that, in fact, there are 3 families. I guess there are a lot of incense makers in Sri Lanka, but there are 3 families in that area that make incense. And they go and they find that one of the families, there's this family business that makes the brands that the girl named, and that one of the partners had been riding on his bike selling incense when he had been hit by a bus and killed.
Wow.
And she also had birthmarks on her abdomen and chest that matched the, Dr. Harrelson got the autopsy report.
Wow.
That matched the wounds that the guy had. Wow. And then when the family took her to that family, to the previous family, she seemed to recognize people, and she would they felt that she showed a knowledge of incense making that she should not have had. And she would even make comments about the incense, like, "Oh, you've got a new wrapper for this type," which was accurate for things that had changed since the previous guy had died. So that, I think, is a very interesting.
Very interesting. Wow.
So it's one, we don't have written records, which would be ideal, but you do have this intermediary, this teacher and the brother-in-law, that can state what they were told. So it's not just the family's testimony that was going on.
Very interesting. Now, for the kids you're investigating, there's a significant number of them have reincarnated in a fairly short time frame, and have died either of a violent death. Or of an acute sense of unfinished business. Can you give me a sense of the parameters of that?
I mean, the acute sense of unfinished business is pretty subjective.
Yeah, sure.
But the other parts of it, yes. The median time between the death of the previous person and the birth of the child is 16 months. So we're talking about very recent lives.
Short, yeah.
Now, there are exceptions to that. And someone describes a life 100 years ago is going to be almost impossible to verify, and I mean, in Asia, it would be impossible to verify most of the time. So we don't necessarily investigate those cases, but we don't hear about them much either. I mean, the ones we hear about, they are describing recent lives and ordinary lives. I mean, they're not talking about being kings or queens or famous people or whatever. They're just describing somebody in a village 20 miles away who had sort of an ordinary life. Except that 70% of them died by unnatural means. So that certainly seems to be a factor in these cases. So you can speculate why it would be a factor.
Is there any, I mean, maybe I might have you speculate some about that, but why, is there any, from the cases themselves, is there any indication of why that might be? From the descriptions of the kids, or from the things they described or talk about? Is there any indication?
No, I mean, certainly with the birthmark cases, obviously, since they're usually birthmarks of fatal wounds, would be a violent death. And we are particularly interested in those cases. So, you may be getting some reporting bias where, you go for those cases. But even in the ones without it, I mean, most of them were unnatural or sudden deaths. I don't think there's anything specific from the cases that would indicate why that is, but it certainly implies that sort of the normal dying process gets changed in some way, either so that people come back and are reincarnated, or at least where the memories would normally not be there, somehow they do come through.
Well, let me pick up on that, because assuming we're talking about reincarnation for a moment, assuming that's what you're mapping, at least in the traditions that have believed in reincarnation, there's often this description in the Greeks and of the sea of forgetting, of the taking a pill of forgetting. Or there's these different metaphors. Exactly. Before you enter the next life. So do you think there would be some indication that somehow this, or because of the violent death, it somehow keeps that normal barrier from operating in the way it usually does, or something?
Yeah, I mean, it implies that the process gets short-circuited somehow.
Yeah.
And some of these kids will talk about time between lives.
What percentage of the kids do that?
Well, it's a minority, certainly. I don't know the exact percentage. Most kids don't.
Right.
But of course, much of what the kids that do say is completely unverifiable.
Right,
they're describing being in other realms or whatever.
Right.
But some of them describe, like there's one of Ian Stevenson's cases where the boy said that he lived in a tree above where the body of the previous personality was dumped after the guy was killed. Lived there for 7 years, and then, these stories sometimes sound a little fanciful, but then he decided he was going to go try to find his mother. He went, the previous mother, went and got lost, like in the market or something, saw his future father, decided he would follow him home, and did so, and then was reborn.
In the father's wife, in that family.
Yeah. And that's one that it turned out that the father had been in that area the month that the mom conceived. So there was at least...
Is that true?
Yeah. So there's and in fact, he said it was a rainy day, and as I recall, the father said, yeah, it had been rainy that day. So there's at least partial verification for his story. But it's one where, he never went anywhere where he could be in the sea of forgetfulness or take the fruit of forgetfulness or whatever.
Yeah.
It was more that he was sort of a ghost or whatever, that he was just sort of there around that area until he moved on to the next life.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So, it may be that in some of these cases, not just that it changes the rebirth process, if in fact that's what this is, but that it changes the dying process where you don't see the light or whatever, that it just makes it different.
That's interesting. Do many of the kids describe the process of the after death, the process of the death and what happens immediately after?
Some of them will talk about like the funeral, for instance, sort of basically hanging around the family, and sometimes we'll give details again that can be verified. But then others talk immediately about sort of floating away or whatever, and being in this other realm with other people or with large golden buildings or whatever. And then some of them describe either being led back to their current family, not led back, but led to their new family, or particularly the Americans will talk about choosing their next parents, like they're in heaven or whatever.
That's more common in the Americans than the...
Yeah, in the Asian ones, it seems like they'll say that they see the parents and choose to go to them. Like they'll see the mom picking flowers beside the road and decide to sort of follow her home and be born to her. Whereas the American ones, it's more like they're in heaven and they pick these folks to go to. And with both cases, sometimes they talk about guides sort of helping them with that decision.
Is that common for people who speak about some time between their lives?
To speak
about guides or
God. Well, none of this is common, but
right.
It's certainly something we hear, or guides or sort of other entities anyway. But then there are a lot of kids who they may not talk about the time between lives, but they are so miserable in the families that they're in. They're begging to be taken to the previous families. That it's hard to believe that they chose to come to this family because they're so unhappy there.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So if you take up all the evidence that's been gathered then and that you've been privy to over the last years, what do you feel then is proved by it, or what do you feel? What's the conclusion you've come to? Is it reincarnation? Is that what you feel we're looking at here? Is that the reasonable conclusion, or are we at that point yet? Or
well, we certainly don't use the word proof because these are not cases that are done under tight laboratory conditions where you can rule out everything. This is in sort of the messy real world where if you're studying a naturally occurring phenomenon, you sort of take what you can get. So they provide evidence, but they are not proof.